I assumed Rick was right about this. I don't know why.
Why would you do that?
My brain was like, that makes sense. Why would he make that up? And he did. He did.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Monster Donut, a literary and historical deep dive into the Percy Jackson series and all of its following spin-offs. I'm Phoebe, a dramaturg and story consultant.
And I'm Emily, a ancient mystery occult enthusiast and classic scholar.
That's a good one for this one.
Yes, Rick really got into the cults. I'm having a good time. It's great.
And this week we are going to talk about the Mark of Athena.
Which, I'm just going to put my cards out on the table here. We had a dinner with a few other Percy Jackson podcasters, and I, at one point during this dinner, said that this was my least favorite of the Percy Jackson books. And everybody, it was like a record scratch. And after reading this book, again, I stand by what I said. Which apparently is controversial. I didn't know I had a hot take, Phoebe.
I feel like Mark of Athena is when the fandom really blew up, online, so that might be a part of it. And it also had such the ending was so crazy that people, when they think of Mark of Athena, are only thinking of how good the ending was.
I mean, it's a great ending, and I will say there are definitely really fun moments in this book. There are some moments that I very much enjoy. Anyway, do you have anything you we need to talk about before we dive in?
This episode's going to be edited by Emily, so if it feels different, that's why.
If you're oh, weird, there's way more classic stuff in this one.
If you're wow, Phoebe didn't talk at all, it's not my fault.
Wow, wait, I thought Emily usually doesn't rant for this long. No, I do, actually. I rant for way longer. Phoebe takes pity on you and cuts it down. She sent me a photo of our Son of Neptune episode, and there's a point where I talk for literally 40 minutes straight.
You're welcome, everybody. It was all interesting.
So, you say that, but okay.
Let's just get into it. Let's talk about this book.
One of my biggest thoughts throughout reading Mark of Athena again was that we've talked a little bit about how typically book 3 of these series have some kind of tone shift. And for a really long time, as I was reading Mark of Athena, there was something bugging me that I couldn't quite put my finger on. When I realized about 2/3 of the way through that I felt like there hadn't really been a tone shift. But I was trying to remember if this is the only time we have a Percy Jackson book that literally picks up right where the last one left off, at least up until this point.
Yeah.
Which, coming back to this now and thinking about it, I'm wondering if that is sort of a more subtle tone shift, because that is a kind of... It's a different start, sort of like we saw in Titan's Curse, to what we've seen before. It's just that this time, instead of skipping way ahead and changing seasons, we're throwing us off balance by just immediately putting everyone right back where they started, right back where they ended before.
I was thinking about that a lot too, because it's the third book, and I made the bold claim that the third book in every series was a tone shift. And so I was watching for it in this one. And I feel like there's an obvious one at the very end. Mm-hmm. But I was there's got to be something in the whole book.
Yeah. I feel like there is a tone shift in this book. It's just not the typical one where, usually it gets a lot darker. I think we start to see that a little bit in this one, but only at the very end.
Just the fact that they're journeying to a totally different country when we've spent all this time in America is its own kind of tone shift. And the fact that we are now handling 7 characters.
Yeah.
Who are all trying to navigate their relationships with each other, that feels different.
Yeah. There's just so much that needs to be reconciled, and it's very messy. And I feel like that is also something that changed, that the status quo does change in that way. This book does open, I realized this a few lines into this chapter, because we open on Annabeth's POV. It really walloped me in a good way. And I realize it's because Annabeth's point of view is the first POV we have gotten in this series where it's a character we've known from the beginning who's not Percy.
Mm-hmm. And we get to finally be in her head a little bit and see how she thinks.
It felt exactly like you said, it felt finally. And I loved being in her head because it made sense to me, her as a character, the way she thinks. And yet it was so different than, I think, the way she presents herself. There's just so much more of her. You, like, actually are getting her uncertainty and her thought processes.
I also noted that you can see her watching the people around her and, like, trying to piece everything together that she's seeing, because she's very concerned with all of the relationship dynamics going on around her first couple chapters.
Well, she even says, like, reading people kind of became a coping mechanism of hers, which thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it's fun to be in her perspective and watch her try to gather as much information as she can about the world around her and, like, watch her make deductions and assumptions. So we land in camp.
There's also the utterly iconic scene of Annabeth running up to Percy, kissing him, and then judo throwing him.
Yeah. Which, like, rereading it, I was like, no wonder people are afraid of Annabeth when she shows up and, like, don't trust the Greeks, because it's like, here's Percy, who they've all come to love and trust. And then this girl lands on a Greek ship and then comes over and, like, apparently tries to kill him. Like, no wonder they were on edge. She really should have thought that through. Not a good move.
Well, I mean, it was a pretty sweet move. I support it.
I don't. I think she shouldn't have done it.
So they land in Camp Jupiter. There's some tension, but everything seems to be going okay. And Annabeth and Raina actually have, to me, I thought was a really fun conversation. Because they talk a little bit about specifically the Roman attitudes towards Athena, or the Roman name for her, Minerva. Because apparently, as Raina kind of explains to her, Minerva is not a goddess of war, but just like a goddess of crafts. And something that's really interesting about Athena specifically is that a lot of people think that she originally was a patron goddess of the indigenous peoples of the area around Athens, which is called Attica. And there's a theory that her name etymologically kind of traces back to this word Atana, which is actually the indigenous name of, like, the rock of the Acropolis. But it's kind of fun because in mythology, you know, there's this whole story about how Athens, the city, is named after Athena, when it seems like the reality is actually the reverse, which I always thought was kind of really cool. The reason why I like this scene a lot between Raina and Annabeth is, aside from the fact that I love both of these characters, Bellona is such a uniquely... Athena, in a way, is a very uniquely Greek goddess, even though she has a Roman aspect. And in that way, Bellona also, to me, is a very uniquely Roman goddess. And again, she comes from, probably we think, a Sabine goddess, which would have been an indigenous Italian goddess. So I kind of liked the duality of these two characters whose mothers are both very... on the one side, very, very Greek, coming from an indigenous, like, Greek place, and very, very Roman, coming from an indigenous, like, Roman hill. Like, I just enjoy the two of them discussing the origins of their mothers and coming to this understanding when it's, like, very much two sides of this sort of same thing. And they kind of balance each other in that way to me. Yeah.
I really liked this conversation, mainly from Raina's point of view, because of how quickly Raina wants to trust Annabeth and, like, wants her close, because, like, everyone else she, like, immediately distrusts and wants to keep at a distance. And, like, when Percy showed up, she doesn't trust that easily. She's trying to protect her home. But Annabeth, there's, like, an immediate kinship with. And they also, like, have that immediate connection because, unlike Percy, Annabeth immediately remembers Raina. And, like, she's already sort of gotten past blaming Percy for what happened, but at least she gets the acknowledgement from Annabeth that happened.
I think in this conversation as well, I also started tracking a little bit. Because remember how last episode I went on a whole rant about how wrong Rick was about the Romans? This book, it feels like he did a lot more research and fixed it. He listened. So I felt like a lot of this book, I felt that shift too, where it felt a lot more like Son of Neptune was a lot about, like, what the Romans would want you to believe Rome was. And in this book, there's a lot more of, like, what Rome actually was.
I definitely felt that.
So it seems as though there's a tenuous peace being achieved between Greeks and Romans, that Juno's plan is working, that Percy and Jason are having a budding bromance or something, when all of a sudden the Greek ship starts attacking the Roman camp out of nowhere.
I only have 2 notes on this battle.
I mean, that's 2 more than me. I have no notes on this battle.
Who threw a brick at Jason?
Oh my god, right. Do we have a Jason concussion count? That's 1. I wrote down at some point in my notes, the real theme of this book is concussions, and I stand by it. Everyone gets conked on the head, especially Jason.
But I was like, Jason is like the hero of Camp Jupiter. And then they just, someone immediately turns on him and throws a whole brick at his head.
I'm almost positive it's got to have been Octavian. That just makes sense.
I think Octavian doesn't come down yet, though, at that point, because my second note on this, so chronologically happens last, is that Octavian is hanging out on the ladder and won't come down, and Percy has to climb up the ladder, so grabs Octavian and throws him into the mob, which was just really funny to me.
Okay, so it wasn't him. Maybe someone else had a grudge. Maybe someone else wanted to be Praetor and just, like, was a dark horse in the running that we never... Maybe someone just really, like, you know what? He's just too perfect. You just gotta take him out.
We need a spin-off about whoever threw that brick at Jason. I need a spin-off, at least a short story about what their deal is. But when they get back onto the ship, it's suddenly Leo versus everyone, especially Percy and Frank. Those 2 hate that little man. Which I appreciate. I like that there were Leo antis on this ship. Leo anti-representation.
So we get the ship out, and then we get the switch to Leo's point of view for our first side quest, because the ship has been damaged, so we need to stop to get some materials. They disembark. Percy and Annabeth go on an adventure to go get some tar. Leo disembarks with Hazel. Just Hazel? Where's Frank?
Frank goes with Percy and Annabeth. Right. Hazel and Leo go on this side quest, and then Piper stays behind with Jason because he
he got conked on the head.
Looks dead, according to Piper, because he can't stay alive.
How many times is Jason described as dead? Now that you pointed it out in our Lost Hero episode, it keeps happening. This man is he's on death's door most of this series.
It's constant.
Hazel and Leo go out to go find this island in the middle of a lake where there's apparently lime and bronze, celestial bronze. And they kind of need this as well because there's some weirdness between Leo and Hazel. Because as it turns out, Leo looks exactly like Hazel's old crush Sammy from her old life in the 40s.
It's so unnecessary. Rereading it, I was like, there has to be a reason, right? That I'm forgetting.
I did figure out how to fold it into my kind of takeaway from this book, but it's also I feel like it's just here to create romantic tension in between Frank and Hazel, but at the same time, it's such toothless tension.
Especially because it doesn't feel like Hazel feels anything other than you look just like my ex-boyfriend. Yeah. For Leo, not any kind of actual feelings for Leo.
Yeah.
And then it's Leo latching onto them and being you pay attention to me?
There's one moment later on that I did think was a little interesting, which was that Leo, after, this is skipping ahead a little bit, but after Hazel shares a flashback to show Leo why she's so confused by his appearance and to show him Sammy and why she liked Sammy, basically, there's a moment where Leo kind of thinks to himself that Sammy is, the better version of him, which got me thinking a little bit, because I felt in this book, the first, theme I kind of thought of as I was reading it was that there was a lot of imposter syndrome happening. A lot of these almost every single one of these characters, even the non-POV characters, have at least one moment where they feel inadequate and they feel like they shouldn't be there and they feel like they're not doing anything to help. But also the sort of secondary thing that emerged out of that thought, that the more I thought about this book, the more I realized that actually I think this book is centered around a giant identity crisis, where I feel like every character on every level, and because this is the thing, right? As I mentioned, I was sort of struggling to figure out how to stitch together all these encounters. What do they all have in common? What are the themes we're exploring? Echo and Narcissus, which is where we're about to, the first major encounter of this book that we're about to have, that was sort of my tipping point, because I was trying to figure out what their purpose was in this story. Because Echo and Narcissus are both characters that, they're a pair. Narcissus is, in some versions cursed, in some versions not cursed, just a douche, is entranced by his own beauty and obsessed with it to the point that he can't look away from like his own reflection. And he's just like tied to just stare at himself. And then Echo, who's always paired with him, is this nymph who also doesn't have her own voice and can only ever like echo back. To me, that really, I feel like holding up the mirror and forcing them to kind of confront this version of themselves, that to me kind of unlocked a lot of what my thoughts are on this book as a whole.
I could see that also with is it Chrysaor? Chrysaor? What's his name?
Chrysaor.
I was like, Chrysler? Like
Yeah, the Chrysler. The Chrysler building.
The Chrysler building, when he and his pirates are all trying to like stick to their roots as pirates, but this one piece of their past of their connection with Dionysus being the thing that still can like tear them apart, like they're stuck still with that old story. Mm-hmm. And them trying to like move past their dolphinness, because I assume that's why the Chrysler building, I forget what you just told me he's actually called.
The Chrissy Kelly, yeah.
Yeah, the Chrissy Kelly. I think I imagine that's why he wears that mask. I don't know if it's ever said that's why he wears the mask, but he's trying to hide his dolphin features in my head. So he's trying to hide that part of who he is, but he can't really escape it because it's part of him and his crew now. It's a part of the gods also, because this is where we start to learn really that they're having their identity crisis, and that like in moments you're meeting Bacchus and in moments you're meeting Mr. D. And, you know, here's Athena, who's having trouble remembering anything because she's Minerva half the time.
Because I feel like there are so many pieces in this book that do sort of bring up this idea of, like, who is the best version of you. Another one is the Eidolons that possess. Because I was looking them up as well, because they're kind of like ghosts in this version. But another interpretation of the mythology is that they're doppelgangers. And I was just thinking about all of the, like, little potential doppelgangers that are scattered throughout, because there's a lot more in this book. Like, even the big bads at the end, the, you know, not Arachne, but the two giants are twins that are constantly, like, stuck in each other's orbit trying to be different versions of the same person and yet not able to break out of that. Like, we'll talk about it in more detail, I think, as we go. But to me, that really stood out as, I think, the main theme of this book, and why I think this book throws me off so much, because I feel like everyone's having an identity crisis in this book, which is why it's sort of hard to get a handle on everybody. So we've already talked a little bit about Echo and Narcissus, but I also want to talk, before we encounter Echo and Narcissus on this beach, we do meet, finally, Nemesis, the mother of Ethan Nakamura. I
think having Nemesis as our first encounter was interesting to set up this book. Technically, the Eidolons are like our first monster encounter, but like that's inside the camp, so I don't really count them. So the first encounter of the quest is Nemesis, and so introducing the book with like balance and justice. On one side, we have the Romans who are currently chasing after them to seek revenge and justice after they've destroyed their camp, but also that whole concept of balance is like what the entire Rome-Greece relationship is supposed to be in this book, where it's like Percy and Jason were traded so that we could find a balance between the two camps. The fact that she offers things through a fortune cookie was interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because I feel like fortune cookies marry luck and fate in an interesting way, where it's like you don't know which cookie you're going to end up with. Like, they just grab one at random and give it to you, or like you get 4 with your Chinese food meal, and it's like, who knows which one you're gonna grab that they gave you, and then once you open it, at that point it's like, here's your fate, which you chose.
She does say one thing that I wrote down, which I think plays into the theme I was just talking about in an interesting way, which is she basically encounters Leo and Hazel right before they're about to meet Echo and Narcissus. And she kind of warns them ahead of time. And part of her warning and part of her description of what lies ahead is saying, quote, "Most heroes cannot escape their nature even when given a second chance at life." And he meets Echo and Narcissus. I spent a while scratching my head because they're, in this version, both mortals who were brought back as part of Gaia's plan. Everyone else we've seen up until this point was brought back with a purpose by Gaia. But it seems like these two just kind of slipped through. like, they don't have a purpose. They're not sitting here furthering the war effort. They're just, like, on a random lake doing what they've always done. Although apparently now Narcissus is a YouTuber.
Right. It's all part of Gaia's plan.
Yeah, to take over streaming or something. So they get all of the ingredients they need. Percy, Annabeth, and Frank return from what looks like a pretty fun little side quest that we don't get to see any of.
Yeah, I'm so mad.
And then Piper has been seeing visions in her dagger Catoptris, and one of her visions is in Kansas. And they encounter Bacchus, who does not say, "I'm Bacchus, Phoebe," which really disappointed
Unbelievable.
me. I know. I can't.
It's like
believe
Rick's
it.
not even listening to us.
I did make a couple notes on the scene. One of which was that I think it's kind of interesting how Jason seems to have had overwhelmingly positive experiences with all of the gods. Like, I'm thinking about, like, Aeolus, like, with Bacchus. Like, they always meet him, and they're like, oh, yeah, that
He's like,
kid.
oh, that's my friend.
He's great. He did me a favor. No muss, no fuss, no questions asked. And then it's immediately contrasted with what I think might actually be one of the most low-key funny moments in this book, which is Percy starts just immediately antagonizing Bacchus because he sees Mr. D in him. He just starts to be like talking back, like arguing with him, being super rude. And as this is happening, we're in Piper's head. And Piper is just sitting there like, what are you doing?
Because she's never seen anyone do anything like this. She's been with Leo and Jason this whole time.
I know, and I just found that so funny because it's just one of those like things that Percy does all of the time, but seeing it from someone else's perspective just makes you realize just how crazy this kid is.
Uh-huh.
Especially, again, contrasted with Jason right there, where it's like, oh my god, thanks for the favor. And it makes me wonder, like, should Percy have just been nice this whole time? Like, could everything have been avoided?
Should he have just been nice and charming? And
No, but I think that's just, like, not who he is, though. So it was just a fun, like, the starkest difference between Percy and Jason here.
I mean, part of it might just be that Jason has always been exactly what he was supposed to be. Like, he's been the perfect hero and shows up to do what he's told. And the gods are like, amazing.
The other thing is, this is the scene that's on the cover.
Yeah, my biggest thing with this moment when they both, like, you realize that they're possessed is the gold eyes. Because I remember reading this for the first time and being like, there's like a response that is elicited from the reader upon reading that people have gold eyes after reading the last book series that, like, no one in the book at that point can acknowledge because Piper's the only one who can see them, like, because Piper's the point of view that we're in, and she has no reason to be like, oh my god, gold eyes. It's like a deep-rooted, like, fear that it pulls back out because it's like, oh, we're past that threat. And then he throws the gold eyes back at you and you don't know what's going on. You know, when you're reading this book for the first time, you're like, oh my god, what's happening? Yeah, so it's definitely, it like feels like such a choice, but it's one that's never acknowledged in this book.
No.
Like, even when Annabeth sees it.
Yeah. You'd think.
I want to be in Annabeth's perspective when she sees that, because it's like, that's like horrifying to see Percy's eyes turn gold. It's like that.
Yeah.
That was the original plan.
Just like having watched Luke, that everything happened to Luke, and then having the threat of it happening with Percy, like, girl.
Yeah. And I think especially in this book, when we keep calling back to Luke, and especially at the end start talking about like that Percy's starting to understand Luke and that he's almost Luke's age, it's like we're just, it's, I don't know, we're setting something up. Maybe we'll follow through. But we also, in this scene, I think, is when we finally learn Gaia's plan, which is to use one male demigod and one female demigod as a blood sacrifice to wake herself.
I haven't like done a ton of research on this, but as I've been looking up a lot of other mystery cults, there is one to the mother, great mother, Mater. Roman is Mater, Greek is Mater, involving blood sacrifice to the earth or something. Maybe this is all just an elaborate cult is all I'm saying, but I'll come back to that later. We love it. We love a blood sacrifice storyline. I'd be lying if I said most of my books I've written don't involve that at some point. I
have one currently in the works. So.
We love it. It's great. Bleed them dry. Anyway, so they get back to the ship, and Piper is able to expel the Eidolons and force them to swear on the River Styx to not possess Percy, Jason, and Leo, because as it turns out, they have been lurking in their little brains the whole time.
Yeah. There was one moment I really enjoyed here because I like getting to see the characters observe each other's relationships, the ones that they built outside of them. So, like, the one I'm specifically thinking of is Annabeth seeing Percy get possessed at the table, or like seeing Percy's, eyes light up gold and everything, and possessed Percy starts intimidating Hazel, and she's like, oh my god, that's my boyfriend, I should get in the way and stop him from intimidating Hazel, because she doesn't know Percy and Hazel's relationship, and Hazel immediately like waves her off and is like, do not worry, I know this man. But like it's because they just spent a whole book together and Annabeth knows nothing about their relationship yet. And so I like getting to see like Annabeth get caught up to speed on where their relationship is, and like we don't get to see as much of Hazel and Frank, who know Jason, seeing Jason's new relationship because we're not really in their perspective. But that's one that I wish was focused on more. But you do get it a little bit with like Piper trying to get used to Jason and Raina's relationship.
Yeah.
And we kind of get it almost ourselves when we see like there are a couple points where we get to see Annabeth's relationship that's grown with the Lost Hero trio, which we didn't get to see because it all happened between the Lost Hero and Mark of Athena. So there's like Annabeth stealing Piper's breakfast, which is apparently an inside joke between them.
Yeah.
Or is it Piper stealing Annabeth's breakfast or Annabeth stealing Piper's breakfast? I think it's Piper steals Annabeth's breakfast. But there are other moments like that where we hear just how the relationship between Annabeth and those three has grown over the past couple months as outsiders. And so I feel like that experience is sort of parallel to Annabeth getting caught up to speed on what Percy's been up to.
My next two notes are just questions that we do not get the answer to that make no sense.
Are they about this scene?
No.
Okay, because there's one last thing I want to say about this scene, which is that a little bit after it, when Piper is talking to Jason, she admits that she almost let Jason kill Percy, which is just so cool of her. She was like, actually, the easiest way out of this situation is to just let him die, which she doesn't say when we're in her point of view. So I thought that was fun because we were in her point of view for that scene and like presumably knew what her thoughts were, but we don't get them. So
what you're saying is this is a great example of the times the POV is manipulated.
It is, because we wouldn't have known that unless she said it out loud. For some reason, this third person omniscient narrator doesn't actually know anything.
I feel like that's fair though. Like the narrator keeps a lot from us.
Yeah, but what I was saying like last time was that now that we're in third person, they can't really hide things from us. But apparently Piper can.
Maybe she's a special relationship with the narrator. I don't know. Maybe
she's charm-speaked her way into the narrator's good graces. And Percy has not figured that out yet, so the narrator will just tell you anything Percy's thinking.
We also hear a little bit more about Annabeth's quest while they're all on the ship. Because we find out, I forget exactly when it's like fully revealed. I think this is the moment. We find out about what the Mark of Athena is, which is that Annabeth, when her last visit with her mother, was charged by giving a coin, a Greek silver drachma, to go to Rome and to avenge her, basically. And as it turns out, Athena is sort of at the center of this Greek and Roman feud. Because in the Rick Riordan verse, the Romans stole this great statue called the Athena Parthenos, that was a statue of Athena that was like 40 feet tall that was in the Parthenon for a really long time, until apparently the Romans sacked the city, took it with them back to Rome as a trophy, and also as a piece of that also took Athena with them and kind of demoted her essentially from being a war goddess to just a goddess of crafts. I'm saying apparently a lot here because it was a good idea, Rick. It's not supported by history, but it's a good idea. What I will say is the Athena Parthenos was mysteriously lost or disappeared approximately, when I say approximately, I mean around like 25 to possibly like 50 years or more off from a Roman sacking of Athens. So I think that's what happened here. What's interesting about the Athena Parthenos is that there's a theory that before Athens was really on the map politically, there was a wooden idol, probably of Athena, that was like passed down and down and down and was like this pricelessly sacred and ancient idol. And in Athens' history, the Persians actually invaded around 500 BC or so, which predates the construction of the... They are actually starting to build a Parthenon, but the Persians raided Athens and the city and, like, destroyed everything, and a lot of the people fled to a nearby island, I believe, Salamis, and they took this idol with them because it was that important and brought it back. And there's an interesting theory that this idol is, like, still kind of embedded somewhere in one of the buildings on the Acropolis, because the Parthenon is not the only building on the Acropolis. There's also the Erechtheion, so a lot of people think that was originally built to house this, like, very sacred thing. And the Athena Parthenos, I feel like in this work kind of continues on this tradition. It's also, like, would have been made of wood, although it would have been much larger and been, like, gold plated and had all this other extra stuff on there. But I feel like that, like, original idol really, for a really long time, was the, like, source of Athena's symbolic and literal power, because, again, she was probably a local goddess first. And then conflated with another Indo-European goddess at some point in Athens' history. Which is why I say that it's like this statue is kind of an amalgamation of them. Purely because there's a lot of, like, famous statues in ancient Greece, but I feel like there are a few of them that are seen to have been imbued with this much power. And I feel like part of that is that legacy of that original statue kind of being embedded as a cultural memory with the Athena Parthenos. So it is really cool to see it still holding that much power. Something else, though, that basically Rhaena had kind of hinted that she knew what was going on to Annabeth in their earlier conversation, but Jason basically says, oh yeah, all the priors know that we, like, stole this statue. But he also apparently knows about all the Athena kids going on quests for it, which, like, how did he know that? Mm-hmm. How did he know that there was an Athena to have kids? The math isn't mathing, Rick. So we find out that that's what Annabeth's after. It's a long-lost statue of her mother that appears to have been imbued with a fair amount of her power and essence that was stolen by the Romans and subdued by the Romans long ago.
Shall we move on to Georgia?
Well, we have a Percy dream.
Okay.
So Percy has a dream where he sees the giants, who are kind of the anti-Dionysus. They're also in black turtlenecks when we first meet them, so I was like, of course the theater giants are in black turtlenecks.
Yep.
Phoebe, as a theater professional, can you comment on the veracity of this?
Every time I'm trying to look extra theatery, I wear my black turtleneck. Mm-hmm. Like, whenever I'm trying to be taken seriously as a dramaturg, I put on my black turtleneck and my glasses. Mm-hmm. It was around this time that I started formulating a thought and didn't finish it. Mm-hmm. Because we've got Mr. D at the beginning, or Bacchus at the beginning, and then we've got his variations, his giant variations.
His Warios, yes.
His Warios. But I was like, maybe this is the Dionysus book. Maybe I can make this the Dionysus book. And I definitely didn't finish that thought, but I was thinking a lot about theater and madness and not so much being drunk, but
mm-hmm. There's not a lot of drunk debauchery going on. Like, there's no... I mean, unless you count the head injuries.
My next note, I don't actually know where it fits in, because it looks like, just looking at my notes, that this whole section is out of order. It's just like stream of consciousness. There's a point where they're arguing over whether or not they should save Nico, and I think it comes after they have that dream, or after Percy has that dream about Nico. Half of the group is arguing, well, half the group, it's really just Jason and Leo who are arguing that they shouldn't go save Nico, that they should focus on their quest, and that they should consider the fact that Nico tried to keep things from both camps, and, like, can we really trust this guy? And they have this whole argument with Hazel, who's really upset with them for considering letting Nico die, and Piper gets angry at Leo and Jason and tells them that they were being cold, and Jason looks shocked and says, "Cold, I'm just being cautious." And I just really liked that as, like, a character moment for Jason, where it was, like, really getting to see Jason's, like, logic brain working, where he doesn't, it's like he didn't even understand for a moment that he was coming across as cold. He was like, I was just doing the logical thing, which is maybe we shouldn't help Nico when it's potentially not beneficial to us.
And it's true. It's like the other... Again, we've talked a lot about how very Roman Jason is, but it's very Roman to be incredibly efficient and, like, make really great strides, but to do so because you're able to completely disregard the value of human life. Like, I think that's where the collective and the legion thing comes from a little bit, because the Romans would basically be like, well, what's a few extra lives to achieve this other thing?
Yeah, it just got me thinking how these two separate groups are trying to collaborate, but even their brains work in totally different ways. But I don't know, because it's also like, even across like Roman and Greek lines, there's like Annabeth and Jason who think in that logical way. And we hear over and over how similar Jason and Annabeth are. It comes up a lot in this book. But then you also have like Hazel, who's on the Roman side, who is like, I can't believe you're making the logical choice right now. And Frank is standing behind her, and it's like, those are the two other Romans. But that makes sense if we're talking about Jason as being the perfect Roman hero, because that's what he is.
Well, I think part of what defines Frank and Hazel, though, is that they're kind of outsiders. Like, they're not the most Romany Romans.
No. And they're newbies. So they were told by someone, can't remember who, to go find salt water in Georgia. And when they get there, they're told that what you think of when you think salt water in Georgia is the aquarium. They're told to find Phorcys, who they assume will be inside the aquarium. So Percy, Frank, and Coach Hedge go to the aquarium. Which I was so glad to see Percy and Frank going on a little mission together.
Yeah. I was really glad to see that Monster Donut has moved on to corporate sponsorship.
Yeah, look at us.
I feel like you have to draw that for this episode. Death in the Deep Sea is sponsored by Monster Donut. Actually, that's our t-shirt. Yeah. We should just make that a t-shirt.
Oh, we should make that a t-shirt. I'll make that a t-shirt. It'll be up in our non-existent merch store.
They also are big into show business too, Phorcys and Keto.
That's when I actually made that note that I was like, is this a book about theater? And then it wasn't. I mean, it could be about theater. I could make it about theater if I wanted to.
You know what they should have called it? They should have called it Showboat.
I guess. But this is when we get a closer look at Percy's new fear of suffocation. It's specifically suffocation. He clarifies that. He's like, it's not drowning, it's suffocation. And the idea of being in the water reminds me of suffocating.
He also, at one point, he's basically brushing it off and says, it's just a stupid phobia. Interesting choice of words, Percy, considering how much he absolutely beat the crap out of Phobos not long ago. That makes me think, like, what would have happened if he encountered Phobos now as opposed to then?
At this point. I was also thinking about this, not because of this, but because of the much later dream sequence where Gaia shows up and shows him the camp on fire, which was the vision that he had in that short story. So I had a similar question reading this book, but not at this point. But we learn that Percy has a fear of suffocating and is nervous about going underwater, even though he knows he can't drown. It's a combination. He says that it's because of the muskeg incident, but I also think it's the prophecy in the last book. You know, it put that fear in the back of his mind throughout the last book, and it hasn't really left.
Yeah. Well, and what's also interesting is he's been recently reminded of that a little bit, I think, through his dream where he sees Nico. Like, the idea of, like, oh, suffocating, that's the thing, where we see, like, Nico in the jar, where, like, he's kind of, like, put himself into a death trance, basically, and it's the food, but it's also, I feel like, a bit of the suffocation and the, like, just being confined and trapped like that.
Yeah. And, like, he starts, like, psychoanalyzing himself later on in the book and tries to figure out why he fears suffocation specifically, which I guess we'll get to later on. But I think there's also this realization that he starts to have in this book, or I don't know if he's realizing it, but I'm realizing it in this book, that Percy is currently experiencing a change in his, like, panic threshold. Like, he will panic much sooner now, but post what Juno did to him. Than he used to. He used to be able to make it through things while like, you know, he was internally panicking, but it wouldn't be stopping him from anything. But then, like, in the last book, we had the moment when he sees the Cyclops and Centaurs, and he has the panic attack. And then in this book, we have him panicking just from, like, trying to make it through this fear of suffocation that he's dealing with, and, like, going near the water. And, like, later on when we see that he can't control the water, it really freaks him out. And so I think that he's currently dealing with a change in how much he can handle And I don't know if he's realized that yet, but I've realized it.
That is really interesting. I want to put a pin in that. I feel like in this scene also, like, Frank has a bit of that. I think he has he's not as uncertain, but I feel like he also has a bit of that, like, oh no, like, am I going to be able to call on my powers when I need them in a snap moment a little bit? Just in terms of, like, turning into a fish, basically. Because there's the moment pretty early on where they're both like, uh-oh, we know how this is going to end. I see giant tanks of water and there are monsters. So I'm almost positive we're going to end up in those.
Yeah. The way the scene goes is just they end up being put on display inside of the giant tanks and Coach Hedge saves them. There's one more thing I wanted to say about this Atlanta scene, which was how fast Percy just like immediately starts trying to talk his way out of the situation. I think like he meets Forces? What was his name? Forky's? Forky. He meets Forky from Toy Story 4. But he immediately reads him and starts going like, well, everybody talks about you. You know, he just like immediately starts lying like to try and get on his good side. Which Frank, I love watching Percy and Frank with each other because it's like Frank is always willing to just go along with what Percy's doing, but he's not as good at it. Like, he's pretty bad at it. And so I enjoy whenever Percy and Frank are together, because Hazel is better at keeping up with Percy. When Percy like starts doing one of his bits, she's pretty quick to catch on, and Frank like will catch on, but like, he doesn't know how to play the game yet. And so I like having Frank around. The same exact thing happens when they meet the Chrysler Building later on.
So next we got Annabeth going off. And we learned one cute piece of information that I enjoy, which is that when Percy was missing, she went to visit Sally every week.
Yeah.
And there are a few details also in this scene that I picked up on. When Athena started glitching and stopped like having as much power because of her Roman aspect coming in, Annabeth's invisibility cap stopped working. And then the other thing that just made me a little sad was that she and Percy don't have gray streaks in their hair anymore.
This has never made sense to me, because they're like stress streaks, and their lives have not gotten any less stressful. If you get gray streaks in your hair from stress, you can lose them by becoming less stressed. But they've been just as stressed, so they should still have the gray streaks, and that's why I will always draw Percy with his gray streaks. Is this also the scene where Annabeth is sitting in her room thinking all these thoughts, and then Frank comes in? It might be. I know it's before they get to Charleston, which is the next scene. I don't have anything to say about that moment other than, like, I think it's very cute that he trusts Annabeth enough to go and talk to her about that and knows that she won't make fun of him. And he also has that one line about Percy where he says, he's a really good guy, I would follow him anywhere, which is just, like, so cute. The love that the Son of Neptune trio have for each other. It's so rarely seen after Son of Neptune, but when it shows up, I'm like, oh, there it is.
So then they stop in Charleston to see a ghost who turns out to be Aphrodite. We learn a little more from Aphrodite about how the Roman demigods sided with the Confederates in the Civil War, because that was something that like was just kind of brought up as an example of times the Greek and Roman demigods had fought in the past. And I'm presuming at some point people were like, hey Rick, you do understand that that means one of them fought on the side of slavery, right? And he kind of deals with it a little bit in this scene, which I appreciate, although, I mean, I don't know. There's a few times in this book that characters call out time, like for example, Hazel calling out like, wait, you what? No, we do not support Confederates.
I imagined that this choice, he wanted to show, I feel like this book, there's a lot of stuff about how sort of dangerous and corrupt Rome still is, even in New Rome. Because we learned that like if they catch Annabeth, they're going to execute her when Reyna shows up later in this scene. And it's like, you're gonna what?
It's very Roman.
We are 16-year-olds. And so I feel like that's a lot of this book, and especially these chapters, is getting like a new look at the way that like Rome is run still. And it might be separate from like the way that the Roman demigods think of themselves, and that like a lot of them are, but that the state of Rome is still Rome. Like it's still New Rome is still Rome.
Yeah.
Is, I think, what we're learning here.
Yeah. And again, they're bringing a lot more, I think, as I was sort of talking about before, they're bringing a lot more of the realities of, like, the Roman mentality and the Roman society into this book, including, like, acknowledging the fact that Rome's economy relied heavily on slavery, similar to the South.
And really just bringing that home with the fact that, like, we emphasize here that the South thought of itself as a new Rome, in the same way that we talked about last time with all of these different cultures over the years thinking of themselves as the new Rome.
Yeah. And it just kind of answered the question of, like, Manifest Destiny, where was New Rome? California wasn't a territory. I don't think California was officially a state until, like, the late 1800s, right? So...
yeah, it was probably somewhere in the South for a while.
Yeah.
But since we're speaking of when the Romans actually show up in this scene, I do want to talk about the conversation that Reyna and Annabeth have at this time. I feel like Reyna shows up and is, like, really angry. Like, she's super angry when she sees Annabeth again. Obviously, they've hurt her camp, but also Annabeth, in her eyes, has threatened her leadership and is letting Gaia tear them apart. And, like, she likes Annabeth so much. She, like, immediately saw herself in Annabeth and was really excited to get to know Annabeth. And I don't know, I do think that Reyna kind of, in my head, I was about to say I don't know if she does that a lot, but then I was like, that's kind of how she treated Percy. As soon as she felt like she could trust him, like, she invested in him a lot. And so she might just be the kind of person who puts a lot of herself into other people once she thinks she can trust them, and then, like, feels like she gets burned a lot. But eventually, Annabeth is able to talk her into letting her go.
There's a great moment that I totally forgot happened, where Annabeth realizes she's in trouble, and all she does is toss her knife, the knife that she's had since she was 7, that she would never part with, into the water. And Percy's just immediately like, she's in trouble.
Uh-huh. How could you forget that happened when Burge made such iconic art of it back in 2000, 13?
I wasn't part of the fandom.
How could you forget? So we are officially on our way to Rome at this point.
Yeah, they go to Fort Sumter and pick up, like, a bronze disc or something that literally never comes up again. Well, it's also to pick up, like, Leo.
Oh, right.
Jason.
Who's, like, probably been knocked out again. I don't remember.
And they're sailing, and there's a sea monster. And Frank, Hazel, and Leo end up defeating the sea monster and getting dragged into a Camp Half-Blood, but for mer people. It was interesting. I think it brings to mind this idea of, like, the alternate realities and doppelgangers, where there's just, like, times... there's so much in this world where, like, it doesn't have to be the chosen one, And I think this was another good reminder of that. It's like, what if it was the fish version of Percy Jackson? Like, what if it was the mermaid Percy Jackson?
The AU.
Honestly, I feel like also this scene drives a lot of Percy's angst weirdly after this, because he's just like, with the mer people didn't want to meet me?
Yeah, I feel like this, and then immediately followed by the Hercules scene, is, like, Percy slowly realizing that he's not the main character, and that, like, the fun stuff isn't gonna follow him anymore. Which I feel like is weird to see, like, to see Percy go from not wanting any part in this story to then feeling uncomfortable when it's not about him. And when he sees the narrative, like, reworking itself around mainly Jason and Leo. Like, sort of Piper, but mainly Jason and Leo. And the way I'm, like, explaining this in my head is that on a meta level, we've talked about how much Percy wants control and, like, the power to shift things to make sure that he and the people he cares about are safe. And if the story isn't about him anymore, he will lose that power. Like, once they all become side characters who aren't central to any of this, like, what's protecting them anymore? And I think you can also make that about the actual in-world plot, like, if the fates and the gods aren't concerning themselves with him anymore. Like, being a pawn for Gaia was all that kept him alive in the last book, and now he's surrounded by other chosen ones, like you said. Not just, like, potential chosen ones, like in the last series, but actual chosen ones. And when everyone around you is chosen, and now the gods are favoring these new kids, and they don't want anything to do with you, like, how essential can you be?
This is the thing, though, because there's a period of that, and then it feels like another piece of, like, it feels like he has to learn all over again that, like, he's not, like, he has to yield.
Yeah.
Which part of me was like, we've already learned this lesson. Why do we need to learn it again? But The point you brought up with the amnesia thing, I wonder if maybe that is the reason. That, like, he has to relearn some things, I guess. Like, we hit the reset button a little too hard. I don't know.
I feel like what he learned in The Last Olympian originally about yielding was that he couldn't always be the hero by acting, and that he needed to give up control and take a step back sometimes and trust in Annabeth and in Luke's intentions. And that part, like that last part, I think did stick with him. But the rest of it, I don't know, I feel like we might be seeing that lesson slipping. Like, I think he was able to do it at the end of The Last Olympian, but the way he acts in this book specifically, you know, like, maybe it's not so much that he was reset by Juno and is relearning things. Like, maybe it's more of, like, the realization that I talked about last time, that he's realizing how little has changed despite everything that happened in the last series. And so that's making him question or double back on, like, basically anything that he learned in the last series, because in his mind, it's like, what was the point of it? So, like, maybe that's the journey that we're seeing him go on, and that's why we're having this backward character development, I guess.
And then their next encounter is, to me, one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting in this book. Because now we're in Piper's Head, and we come up to the Straits of Gibraltar. So we've already made it pretty much all the way across the Atlantic, and we're about to enter the Mediterranean, where there's this thing called the Pillars of Hercules, which are a thing in mythology where, like, Hercules, like, put up these two pillars on either side of, like, on one side on Spain and the other side in Africa to, like, mark the edge of the known world. This scene is crazy because we get to meet Hercules.
And he's just like a guy.
He's just like some guy.
He's like the most normal. And then, like, slowly they start to realize he's not that normal.
I was curious how he like compared to the version of Hercules we saw in Titan's Curse. Because I feel like in Titan's Curse, this dude was way more jacked. Right? Like, am I wrong?
He gave off more, like, jock vibes. Like, like some more high school bully vibes. Here he seems very chill until he isn't.
Yeah.
But I did like the description that Piper gives of him, where she says that there is sadness and darkness in his eyes.
Yeah.
Which I liked. I don't know. I was going back and forth throughout this scene on whether I thought that Hercules represented Jason or Percy more.
Interesting. Because what I wrote down here was that I felt like Hercules reminded me of Percy. Like, the way he was acting and talking.
Doesn't he just remind you of Percy a little bit? But someone in, I'm pretty sure, The Lost Hero says that Jason has a sadness in his eyes all the time. And so this description of, like, Jason and Hercules bonding over the fact that they're brothers and both having that sadness, I liked that. And I wondered if Thalia had it too. But just the description in general just feels much more Percy. Especially there was one line where he was talking about how much pressure he was under.
That was literally the line I wrote down.
Yep, and considering, like, Percy's whole deal in this book, he's specifically talking about being Zeus's son or Jupiter's son. I forget who we're talking about at this point. But he says it's a lot of pressure. Enough is never enough. Eventually it can make a guy snap. Yeah, it just felt very Percy to me, considering the journey that Percy's going through in this book, which is fun because Percy tries so hard not to be like Hercules.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, because I think Hercules, he's immortal, because in mythology, he chose the deal that Percy did not, which was that the gods offered to make him immortal, basically, for services rendered. And he picked it. But he's stuck. He's not even stuck in stasis in, you know, the moving of the West. He's stuck in the Old West, which I thought was really interesting. Like, he's stuck on the Straits of Gibraltar. He's stuck. He can't move on in a way that, like, even a lot of the monsters have been able to. Then Jason, our poor concussed boy, forgets mentioning Hera is a bad idea around Hercules. There's a peculiar thing where I feel like Hercules really puts a lot of the blame of his life onto Hera. It's kind of ambiguous, because he does have to do his initial labors because he murders his wife and children. But there is some ambiguity in the myth as to, like, if he does it and then if it's because of, like, God-given madness or not, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that, again, it's sort of this idea of, like, there's two different versions. There's two different Herculeses. There's the one Hera cursed, in a fit of insanity to murder his wife and kids. Then Hera forced him to atone by doing all of his labors. And then there's the other version where, Hera isn't just fucking with him the whole time. Like, he did actually do something evil and now has to atone. And I feel like this scene, this coupling of scenes really plays with this idea of, like, do you know this man? Like, do you know who this person is? Do you know which version of Hercules we're talking about? Because the way he, as soon as Jason mentions Hera, the way he kind of flips on them without remorse or even regret and forces them to do an impossible task just like he did really is striking to me.
Yeah, this is part of a theme that's starting to show up in just the stories that we're talking about, which is how many of the encounters that they have in this story are just people who see themselves as or have actually been betrayed by or ruined by in some way by the gods. Especially Hera comes up a couple times, but with like
done a lot of bad things.
Using that version of the Echo and Narcissus story where it's like it was a punishment that Narcissus is over there like that. And then it seems like we're going with the Hera punished Hercules story, and like later on we'll get the dolphin crew and Arachne, and like it's just those are going to start building up throughout this book. A lot of the monsters in all of the books, just that's their origin story, but it's not one that we focus on as much as we're focusing on it in this book, where it seems like every monster that shows up has some. I'm sure the shrimp even had some kind of backstory that if it could have talked, it would have been like, can you believe what Zeus did to me? But yeah, that specifically, that will sort of culminate in a scene at the end of the book that we'll talk about.
There's also an interesting piece of this exchange, too, where after Hercules turns on them and kind of gives them an impossible task, Jason's trying to placate him, and he's like, come on, we're both sons of Zeus. I understand, like, what you're going through. And Hercules basically shuts him down and is like, no, you don't. You have no idea. The only person who maybe understands me is Dionysus. I just thought that instant shutdown was so interesting, of like, no, absolutely not. So anyway, he assigns Piper and Jason a theoretically impossible task of finding a river god and breaking off his other horn, which Hercules had broken off his original horn. This idea that they're also both tethered to this island together, it comes up a bit too.
Yeah, as punishment for each other. Yeah.
There are times when there's definitely gray areas with the monster encounters. And there's a lot of gray areas in terms of, like, the demigods and on the side of Kronos, for example, and everything else. But I found this scene to be particularly interesting because the narrative calls out both Achilles and Hercules, like, equally for not just being in the wrong in some aspects of their actions, but actually for avoiding all of the blame for their actions. Because both of them kind of have this narrative of like, no, I had no choice. I had to do what I did, even the bad things, because I had Hera making me do it, or I had something else making me do it. There's no person in the right here. There's no person who's even more right here. They're both just kind of bitter and avoiding responsibility, and both have been wronged but also done wrongs, and they're just stuck together forever. So anyway, they do succeed in getting the horn. Piper pulls a Percy, cuts it off, and they flee the island after bringing it to Hercules after he admits them passing through. Also, another thing I noticed, I thought it was interesting that Hercules, so again, they're leaving. Hercules is like chucking coconuts at them, and I was sitting here like, this feels almost reminiscent of Polyphemus in the Odyssey.
And in Sea of Monsters. And that was Percy leaving behind a child of Poseidon, and Jason leaving behind a child of Zeus. So we get back to the ship and shift back into Percy's perspective, where he has another dream.
Something I found really interesting about this book is that every POV character has a different avenue for seeing the future. Percy has dreams. No one else has dreams. It's just Percy. And then Piper has Katoptris, her dagger. Annabeth has a prophecy for the Mark of Athena. And Leo...
a fortune cookie.
has a fortune cookie.
Yeah, so Percy has this dream. He gets his first sort of glimpse at Arachne. There's this one line that one of the twins has where he says that Annabeth is preferred as the blood sacrifice. And he says, and the boy, the son of Poseidon, you can see why those two would be most suited for the task. which stuck out to me because it suggested to me that there is more to this blood sacrifice than just being a blood sacrifice. Like, being most suited to the task makes it sound like there's more that's expected of them. So
I guess we'll revisit that when we find out more.
We'll revisit that.
Of the plan. This is the point at which I started to think a lot about how I felt this book paralleled a lot of Battle of the Labyrinth. The Mark of Athena quest, like, reminds me of the quest for Pan. Because it's just this doomed, like, mission you have to undertake to, like, restore honor, restore, you know, a legacy, you know, bring back, you know, something from the past that everybody dies on. That ultimately leads to this, like, ancient monster and is a trap. So, well, Percy can't finish his dream anyway because they get rammed by another ship. My only note on this is I just want a shot-for-shot remake here of the first scene of Black Sails.
Well, listen, it's actually more similar to a scene at the end of Black Sails, but you wouldn't know that.
Fair enough.
I loved this scene. Maybe it's just me loving pirates, but I loved this scene.
No, it's a good one. There's a lot here, like, under the surface, just with his crew and their connection to mythology. The fact that they're, like, again, it's like the old world versus the new, right? Like, why is he here and not elsewhere? Like, why is this man not in the Sea of Monsters? Why is this man, like, in the Mediterranean?
I wondered if that was because no one's telling his story.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people that we meet who have kind of faded from memory.
Yeah, although, and yet Hercules, you know, is arguably one of the most famous demigods ever.
Yeah,
and he's
and some
here
of them
too.
are just staying behind.
But I wonder if maybe Hercules has different aspects. Maybe this is just one aspect of Hercules.
Yeah. If it does have to do with the fact that no one's telling his story, I thought it was interesting that that's the whole reason that he's a pirate, is that no one was talking about him. Like, people refused to tell his story, so he was like, piracy, like, relies on storytelling, that's all that it's about. But he says that he's heard Percy's story. And so it was funny seeing this one guy who's like, his whole thing is that, like, nobody tells my story. And then standing up to Percy, who he's like, I know who you are. Which I know is partially because it seems like he's working with Gaia and her forces. But it's just fun that his story has spread to that point.
This scene is interesting as well because Percy is like, I got this sword fighting wise. And then he does not.
There's this point where he's fighting and he says, many of Percy's powers had gotten stronger over the years, but now, too late, Percy realized that swordplay wasn't one of them. He was rusty, at least against an adversary like Chrysaor. They battled back and forth, thrusting and parrying. Without meaning to, Percy heard the voice of Luke Castellan, his first sword-fighting mentor at Camp Half-Blood, throwing out suggestions, but it didn't help. To me, you know, in my head, I've always imagined that Percy's sword-fighting skills got better over the years, which I'm sure they did at least a little bit. But I hadn't considered that, like, Luke was Percy's best sword-fighting mentor, and so his skills would only ever be as good as what Luke taught him. Because we know that he never got better than Luke, because he was still losing to Kronos.
Yeah.
To the same tricks, because he was using Luke's sword-fighting skills. And so Percy never actually got better than what Luke taught him, but he was Luke's best student. And so having this moment where it's like Percy realizing that he never actually kept learning because he's been better than everyone since he was 12.
Yeah.
And also the fact that Luke, when he comes up, this is like one of maybe 3 times that Luke's name comes up in this book, and it's never as a villain that Luke's name pops up. Yeah. Luke is only referred to as, here, it's his sword fighting mentor. There's been a shift in the way that we're talking about Luke at this point.
Yeah.
That I enjoy.
There's also a bit of a shift because I don't know if you clocked this or not, but he also talks about the blessing of Achilles and not the curse.
Oh, does he?
Yeah, he calls it the blessing. It is really interesting that Percy, you're dead to me, Jackson, is now thinking of Luke like, oh, my teacher.
Right, and then he's like hearing his voice in his head, like giving him suggestions. Like that's crazy.
Yeah, but this is, I think, one of Percy's big. Like I mentioned, like every character kind of has a moment where they're just like, I'm not doing the thing I should be good at well. And this is like Percy, and the aftermath of this battle, I think, is also kind of Percy's moment.
Yeah, that's where he really starts introspecting. But before we get to that Percy does defeat the Dolphin Man.
He does, with trickery.
With trickery, and by remembering the myth and piecing everything together, which that's something that becomes pretty rare for him, because I think the books start to fall into the, like, Percy doesn't know anything about myths trap, which, like, it's not true. But he used to do it all the time in, like, Lightning Thief, Sea of Monsters era. He would remember the myth and start piecing together how best to defeat the monsters that he was facing. And so I liked returning to that and letting Percy do that again.
Yeah.
So Percy recognizes the myth that these guys are from, which is the one where Dionysus turns the guys into dolphins, which has been referenced several times in these books. And basically they just pretend that their captain is Dionysus to scare the crew. The other thing I was going to say about this scene, but I already kind of said, was that I like the way that Frank plays off of Percy in this scene.
Yeah.
I mean, they all play off of Percy because he's, like, putting on a show here. And it's like, look, the girls, they've lost their mind. And Hazel and Piper are like, oh, God, we've lost our minds. Yeah. But I like that the way that he pieces together what he's about to do is at first by looking at Frank. And is like, thank God that Frank is here.
Yeah. No, that plan would not have worked without Frank.
Because he knows that Frank will go along with him and knows how to play off of him. Because that's what the Son of Neptune trio kind of do together a lot, is like play off of each other's improvisation, especially when they're with Percy, because that's it's like they're used to him. And so he knows that he can go for this plan and that Frank will be a part of it. Yeah. So they defeat the dolphins and offer up their ship as a sacrifice to Dionysus. And Percy gives up $6 million, which were on that ship. I would never. That's, like, shocking to me. I would never do that.
Yeah, that's like such a big sacrifice, especially to, like, Dionysus or Bacchus.
I was like, Percy, just, like, take $1 million. He won't miss it. I feel like Percy's introspection here at the end of this scene is really valuable for some of the reasons that we've already mentioned, but also I think it's the fact that Percy is realizing here how little power he has, and that he only seems to see his own limits instead of, like, how much he actually is doing for people.
Yeah.
And the fact that he wants to protect his friends and family, and, like, he just wants the power to be able to do that, and he wants to be stronger. That's his wording, is that he wants to be stronger. Which, I didn't remember this when I said that was why he wanted to feel powerful way back when. But confirmation. And he also thinks of it about how he worries that if he gives up even, like, an ounce of his responsibility, that other people will get hurt because he didn't take charge. And so that's where he starts to feel that weight and feel like he's suffocating because there's so much pressure on him, which ties back to the stuff that Hercules said. I think it's important to have this so close to the Hercules chapters, just to, like, hammer home that he's the real Hercules parallel here. Right. So after this, we have Percy's dream, which you were about to talk about.
I have one note on this dream, which is the dream ends with Percy looking down and watching himself crumbling to dust like a monster.
I wrote that one down too. It's partially foreshadowing for the fact that he's going to fall into Tartarus. He's going to end up in Tartarus at the end of the book. But, like, the traits, the things that he's analyzing about himself in this moment before he falls asleep are the things that are going to make him start feeling monstrous in a second. And so it's also foreshadowing for that. So
then they get to Rome. I just wrote down to Phoebe. What do you recognize?
What do I recognize?
I don't know. So for those who don't know, Phoebe studied abroad in Rome. I have been to Rome one time for like a couple days. So I'm not super familiar with the exact layout of Rome. But Phoebe, you're pretty familiar with Rome.
I'm very familiar with Rome. And this description of Rome that we get as they're flying in is, like, exactly what my thesis was about in college. Which is that, like, feeling that Rome... I described it as Rome feeling like it's confused. Because you have these, like, old buildings next to these modern architecture, and, like, the Catholicism in every piazza right next to ruins, right next to a modern building. Like, it just feels like it doesn't know what it is. And that's kind of what's described as they're flying over Rome. Although here, I think it's described as, like, it wants to be the entire world at once, which I also liked that. interpretation, that it was just Rome trying to be everything all at once because it wants to be the entire world.
Yeah.
I think it says that specifically about the variation of different trees that are there that shouldn't all be in the same spot, but they are. And it's definitely accurate in that way. There are definitely some things that he says here that are very confusing to me. They're eating pizza. I was so confused by this. I always think of this moment where they're sitting there eating pizza. Because in my head, I was like, oh yeah, Percy eats pizza and says that it's bad, and I can't believe he doesn't like the Roman pizza. He probably ate it in a touristy area. Because the pizza in Rome is good. It's right next to Naples. Of course the pizza's good. But then rereading it, I realized that the reason that I don't like this scene is because Annabeth makes the bold claim that people don't eat pizza in Rome, and that only tourists eat pizza. And I was like, what? Where did she hear this? They have this whole interaction with the waiter where he's like, unbelievable that you're trying to eat in my restaurant at 12 p.m. And I was like, why wouldn't they? That's a normal time to eat. I just don't get it. Especially because he comes out with a square of pizza. So they clearly, the only places you can get square pizza in Rome are in tourist destinations or in takeaway pizza spots. That's where you go up to the counter and you say, I want a pizza, and then they take it and they cut it in half and they fold it like a sandwich and you walk away with it. And the pizza's really good in a lot of them. So I was like, I don't know where Rick ate. I'm pretty sure he just got he went to visit Rome and got some tourist pizza and was like, the pizza in Rome is terrible. I can't believe they gave me this bad pizza. They must not eat pizza in Rome. Anyway, it's just an insane statement to make, to be like, pizza's only for tourists. I was like, what are you talking about?
So we meet Rhea Silvia and Tiberinus, who are Rhea Silvia is the mother of Romulus and Remus. Tiberinus is the god of the Tiber River. But they look like Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck. They do say, Rhea Silvia and Tiberinus, when Percy asks, like, hey, why do you look like an American movie? They do say something kind of interesting that I feel like is sort of a throwaway line, but I want to come back to, like...
Yeah, I know exactly what line you're about to say.
Where they basically say, like, well, Rome affected the world, but the world also affects Rome, which means that, like, all of the stuff going on and, like, the development of the West, like, is still happening in Rome itself. Which makes sense, because obviously Rome is an ever-growing, ever-changing, still thriving metropolis. But it's interesting to me because I feel like for a while now they've portrayed the old world as sort of fixed and like done and like that's that, and now we're here, and it's not like the mythological components aren't changing there anymore because they're adapting and changing to fit their new home. And then Annabeth gives her letter of recommendation
and the map that they tried so hard to
and
get,
the map,
which didn't help them at all.
Oh my god. For context, by the way, when I first read Mark of Athena, I texted Phoebe so angrily because I was like, Phoebe, where's the map? And she was like, what are you talking about? I was like, you know how they go through all of that pain at Fort Sumter to get this map and then never use it? And she was like, oh my god, you're right. And then I had the same conversation with Fran like a couple weeks ago where I was like, Fran, do you remember the map? And Fran was like, no, I don't remember the map. What are you talking about? Anyway, so, and then Annabeth goes off to begin her real quest for the Mark of Athena.
Yeah, and I want to talk about this Mithras stuff.
Yeah, so she's told to find the altar of a foreign god, which immediately made me like, uh-huh. And she sort of ends up in this tunnel system, and this is where Annabeth has a bit of her, like, uncertainty, because she's kind of going through this alone, really thinking about the fact that, like, she doesn't have any magic with her, like not even her invisibility cap, and she doesn't have any special crazy powers like any of the rest of the seven. It's just her and her brain, and that's it. I think we've talked a lot about how each of these characters is kind of a chosen one in their own way, and this is Annabeth's chosen one moment. This is the thing that makes her a chosen one in this series, and yet at the same time it's not for any of the reasons. It doesn't give her the same cachet, it doesn't give her any of the same things that everyone else's does. So she ends up in this place where there's all these mosaics that are depicting all of these ritual things, and it is a Mithraeum, which is where people would worship Mithras. Phoebe, what do you want to talk about here?
What I want to talk about is this felt so random to include. And so I was like, there has got to be a reason. And so the reason I settled on was the fact that it takes either 7 levels of initiation for this cult.
Mm-hmm.
And that there are 7 symbols in the ground. And so I looked them up to see what they were, because Annabeth can only see a couple of them. But I was like, I'm sure there are more if I look them up. And there were more when you look them up. And I was like, I'm going to make this about the 7, because that feels very specific that he chose one that has 7 things that you have to go through. And so my thought was that he was included because the 7 levels each represented a member of the 7. Because there are levels for Venus, Mars, Jupiter. And so I was like, well, those 3 are covered.
Oh, yeah. Mithras she's an astrology girly.
Yeah, so they each have, like, planets and gods that they're associated with. But I didn't get, that was the thought, and then I didn't have time to keep thinking it.
Interesting. So as I've talked about a bit before now, there are a lot of really interesting mystery cults in the Greco-Roman world. And the cult of Mithras is really a Roman one. It doesn't really appear in the Greek world. And what it actually is it's the worship of Mithras, who is I believe, Persian or Iranian, he's like an Indo-Iranian god that we don't know exactly how it started, but it became extremely popular, specifically among the Roman soldiers and merchants and people traveling around a lot. There are certain people who think it is maybe possibly a precursor to something like the Freemasons, but it's really not. It's just like the fact that there's like initiation, and there was all of these different, what we call Mithraeum, so it's a place where you worship Mithras, scattered all across the Roman world, and they all seem to have very similar, like iconography, decorations, things, rituals happening, as opposed to a lot of the other mystery cults that were not widespread, that were very like location-based and focused. That also had like a bit of a more diversity in terms of like how they practiced their religions. The way I kind of connected it, well, there's a few different reasons I think this is here. There's a cynical reason, and then there's the like analysis reason. The cynical reason is that what's interesting about the cult of Mithras, in terms of what we know about it, is almost all of the mystery cults we know of in the classical world, we have a lot of evidence in the literature about it and very little evidence in the archaeology. The cult of Mithras is actually the opposite. We have a lot of archaeological evidence of Mithras scattered all across the Roman Empire, and very little written about what they actually did or what it was all for or like what they believed. Which is why this scene is really funny, because, you know, it's not like, Rick is basically doing a bit where we don't really know what any of the purposes of these rituals were. Like, we have guesses, and we don't really know the full extent of the mysteries, so we're just gonna basically take an incomplete picture and paste it on the wall. Because this is the thing, right? Like, we can only really reconstruct the Mithras story through, like, mosaics and depictions of it in art. But we have no one wrote it down. So we don't know what it's supposed to be. We have no idea what this dude's deal is. We just see images of it and like kind of have to figure it out, which is sort of what Annabeth is doing in this scene.
Yeah.
Because we've lost the institutional memory, the cultural context of what we're looking at when we look at these friezes, we've lost his story. We can only guess. I think that really speaks to what memory means, not just like on an individual level, which is kind of how we've been talking about it up until this point, but also on an institutional level. And I think it really shows how identity is the product of selective memory and brings that all kind of full circle.
Yeah. So we make it past a series of trials. I don't think we really need to list out all of the trials. Mm-mm. She smarts her way through all of them. That's kind of the point of them, is that you're supposed to smart your way out until she makes it to the room where Arachne is.
And Arachne says to her, "I have seen you in my dreams."
She also says that she like specifically chose Annabeth to be the one who made it through, which was interesting. But this is also an example of what we talked about in the Lost Hero episode, with like the story that's told not necessarily being the story that the person it happened to believes. Because Arachne says that she didn't lose the contest with Athena. She says that she was the better weaver, and that Athena like basically rewrote the story afterward, cursed her and rewrote the story.
Which I buy. That makes sense.
Trying to bring Athena's wrath down on this podcast again.
Sorry.
But before we can get this full scene, we do jump back to Leo, Frank, and Hazel, who are currently exploring the Pantheon.
Yeah. They're trying to find, what are they doing? Oh, they're trying to find the giant slayer.
Yeah. And instead they end up finding, like, an old workshop, basically.
Yeah.
They used to belong to Archimedes?
Yeah.
Which I took no notes on this because I was like, that's cool.
It's a little bit random. I don't really have many thoughts on Archimedes. I will say it is interesting. Again, like, this is where a lot of the Battle of the Labyrinth stuff comes in. Because, you know, they kind of are equating him. There's a line where it's like, oh, Archimedes was just as brilliant as Daedalus, except more, actually even more brilliant. And, you know, they find this, like, lost book of, like, his spheres and all of this stuff. And it's very reminiscent of all of this knowledge that Daedalus has. And, like, Leo gets his chance to kind of, like, rediscover that from his hero.
Yeah.
I don't really have much more to say about Archimedes. Sorry, I'm not a mathematician.
No, well, this is where we have a little bit of this with Annabeth, but we also get it here. And we'll also get it, I think, in a Percy chapter a little bit later on, where people start to suggest that the labyrinth is back.
Yeah. And this is a little bit of a clue.
Yeah, and so it makes sense that we're getting these Battle of the Labyrinth references because we keep going down underground and being like, this sure feels like the labyrinth.
Mm-hmm. And then we switch gears again, and we got another quest. This again, we're changing, we're rotating.
And this is one of my favorites. I love this.
Then we get the beginning of the dark tone shift.
Oh, you see this as the beginning of the darker tone shift. Okay.
I will say this is where we get Jason, like, expressing his, like, oh no, I'm useless angst. But Jason's is funny because his is like, oh man, I keep getting knocked out. And not able to do anything.
I think he's gonna do it again in this next scene. So why did they go down here again?
Piper saw it in her vision.
Oh right, Piper saw it in a vision, so that they go down and they do it.
Yeah, and this is again where I appreciate a small detail where it's like the steps don't go all the way down. I was like, this is true. Whenever you see a building where the steps don't go all the way down, it is probably a fountain.
But it's empty at this point, and we find out that it's because the nymphs who were invited here long, long ago have been left behind, and the aqueducts have been redirected, so what was once a beautiful fountain is now empty.
It's a true, like, horror moment, honestly. Like, they kind of just, again, lock all the exits, take away all their chances, and say, oh, well, you've wandered in here. There's no water here anymore, so we're gonna steal and drink up instead the Piper's youth and beauty, the power of the sky and Zeus from Jason, because they're also apparently the nymphs that raise Zeus, and then take Percy, the water from Percy. For me, what I found really interesting, too, is so they begin to flood the Nymphaeum with evil water. And Percy, I can control the rivers of the underworld. Jackson can't control this water.
Yeah. It, like, completely freaks him out.
Yeah. And part of me wondered if this was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy where... Because, again, I feel like part of the reason why he was able to control the rivers of the underworld is because in his brain he was like, why wouldn't I be?
Yeah.
Even though at the same time he was also like, this shouldn't work. This isn't like water. And yet here he has trouble with something that's probably much closer to water than the rivers of the underworld.
Yeah.
And Percy does start to drown. So does Jason. He dies again.
Percy at least comes out of it conscious. Jason doesn't.
Yeah.
My note here was just, Jason, get up. The way that they get out of this, Piper remembers a story, like an old Cherokee story, that her dad once told her about a man who sacrifices a dog and basically in return is able to protect his family from a flood. And it's the equivalent of the flood story that's in all cultures. And so she pulls from that and figures what we need is a sacrifice. So the way that they do this is Piper takes the cornucopia that she got from the bull guy. And
Achilles.
She says that they all need to think of clean water, like a storm of water, don't hold anything back. Picture all of your power, all of your strength leaving you, is what she suggests. And when Percy says that's not hard, she says, but force it out, offer up everything, like you're already dead and your only goal is to help the nymphs. It's got to be a gift, a sacrifice. And they all go quiet, and Jason says, let's do it again together. And that's basically how they do it is that they willingly give up all of themselves to the water, and they're able to summon clean water. And I just want us to hold on to this chapter.
It's a good scene.
It's a good scene. I like when Percy's scared. And I like that Piper gets to see him scared, because I know she has a certain, like, when she talks about Percy, I think earlier in the book, she's like, she expected him to be very intense and like larger than he seems. Like she's actually not that impressed with him when she meets him. Just she was expecting to be very impressed from the way that Annabeth talks about him. And then she meets him and she's like, this is just a guy. And so I like that, like, that's just kind of the version of Percy that Piper seems to see a lot of the time. And like she does have those moments where she's like, she knows how powerful Percy is. Like she saw it when she was out there and Percy and Jason were fighting, but her first impression of Percy was just, this is a guy. Anyway,
they free the nymphs, which is nice. Then they continue on and they find the giant's place, which is the Hypogeum, which is underneath the Colosseum, which is basically the staging area.
Yeah.
Where they will stage a complete destruction of the city of Rome, which have been the stakes for this book the whole time. We just haven't talked about them.
Yeah, just don't worry about it.
That's fine.
So this whole fight breaks out and everything. And finally, Mr. D, or Bacchus, shows up. But he basically, he sets it up so that he can sit there and just enjoy the show. And Percy's reaction, he says he feels as small and insignificant as a bug. And he also feels very angry. Very is in italics, so you know it's bad. He says, fighting giants was one thing. Bacchus making it into a game was something else. Percy remembered what Luke Castellan had told him years ago when Percy had come back from his very first quest. Didn't you realize how useless it all is? All the heroics being pawns of the Olympians. Percy was almost the same age now as Luke had been then. He could understand how Luke became so spiteful. In the past 5 years, Percy had been a pawn too many times. The Olympians seemed to take turns using him for their schemes. Maybe the gods were better than the Titans or the Giants or Gaia, but that didn't make them good or wise. It didn't make Percy like this stupid arena battle.
It reminds me of, like, your point with the arena last time, what it was trying to show Luke, and it feels like Percy is seeing what Luke was supposed to in this moment.
It's exactly that. And it's... I, in my mind, this is the culmination of all of those moments that I was talking about with all of these encounters, that all of them have been done wrong by the gods. And so it's like throwing all of those in your face over and over every time they have an encounter. It's because of something that the gods did to them. And then at the end, we finally get Percy having this realization that we've been begging him to have for books and books because of the way that he's treated by Bacchus in that moment. And it's just, this is like one of the all-star moments of this entire book for me. I was finally getting Percy to like explicitly have this thought. And it all comes out of Percy feeling small and like a pawn. It's the pawn thing again. It just keeps coming back to that specific word. It's just so good. I'm so glad that this book is like, because we also have, I think the third reference to Luke is that like Annabeth just thinks of him at one point while she's thinking about her childhood. Like Luke in this book is never brought up as like the villain of the last series, or like it's usually when he comes up it's like, well, we all hate Luke, we know we all hate Luke, but, and in this book it's like, no, we're done with that. So just the series' perception of Luke has kind of shifted as Percy's perception of Luke has shifted. I forgot that this happened, so when I got to this I was like, no way.
Yeah. And then we cut to Annabeth. And I also found that Annabeth's scene with Arachne reminded me a bit of the fight with Antaeus because of the way Annabeth kind of is fighting while tangling up in all of these webs, and like kind of felt like the chains of the ceiling. So they're kind of like both going through their arena scene in a way. And also how Annabeth, I feel like, really Percy's Arachne. She
really does. She like it's the same kind of trick that Percy would play. But it's also got its own like Annabeth flair to it.
And it's interesting because what she really gets to with Arachne with is this idea of like the immortal fame, which I feel like is not something, like they talk about it in the abstract a lot with the monsters, I think, when Percy's trying to manipulate them, where they're like, oh yeah, like you're going to be totally appreciated for everything and everyone's going to know who you are. But it's never like for a reason. It's just like them sweet talking. Versus for me, what I found with Annabeth was like, what all the stuff she was saying to Arachne it was true.
Yeah.
Where she was genuinely impressed with like the artwork and like everything.
I feel like Annabeth and Arachne are very similar, and that Annabeth could see that. And also saw how similar Arachne was to Athena.
Like that appeal to the fame and it being like something that felt real, like a realistic like thing to say, even if you weren't manipulating this person. And then also like the fact that Arachne like dreams of Annabeth, it sort of all serves to remind us that like Arachne did start off as a human. And I think I like to flag when, you know, the monsters and the mortals kind of have some grayness between them, like what defines what. But I feel like here is where we really see why it's important to mark all of those things and why it's important to remember, because I think it all feeds into what you were saying about how a lot of these monsters were just normal people done dirty by the gods. And how fine that line is, you know, when that's really something you don't have control over.
Yeah. My favorite part of this scene, as we get to the end of it, is after Annabeth has won and Arachne is in her trap, she starts gloating, and just like she could easily leave, or it could even play into, you know, Arachne has this moment where she's like, oh, you're gonna call your friends about my artwork, like you're still gonna like keep that sort of promise to me, maybe. And like she could leave and be like, yeah, I am, bye, and like leave Arachne in her trap. But instead what she does is she just stands there and basically rubs it in Arachne's face that nothing that's displayed on Mount Olympus is going to be Arachne's work. It's going to be the Athena Parthenos after Annabeth takes it from her. And that it's going to unite the Roman and Greek camps, and all of this will be because of... Well, she's telling Arachne that it's going to be all thanks to Arachne because she knows that it'll get a rise out of her. But really what she's saying is it'll be all thanks to me because she's done it. She's found the Athena Parthenos. And the reason it's my favorite moment is because this is Annabeth's downfall. This is the reason the entire ending happens, is because Arachne gets so angry at her that she starts flailing around and starts breaking the room because it's already unstable. And so the next scene ends up playing out all because Annabeth couldn't help herself, basically.
And I know we kind of closed the book on this a little bit, but it's so Odysseus of her.
It's so Odysseus. It's literally the scene that we actually already saw play out in Sea of Monsters with Clarice doing the exact same thing. Yeah. It's just her fatal flaw comes and gets the best of her. And we see that so rarely. They're always like, this is my fatal flaw, and then like nothing bad actually comes of it. And here like something extremely bad comes of it. Yeah. Because what happens in this scene is the Argo 2 basically crashes through the ceiling and comes to save her. And Arachne has told us that the floor, it's right above an entrance to Tartarus, and that's what's cracking right now. So Annabeth has to get out of there immediately. And so does the Athena Parthenos. And so, like, some people are working to lift up the Athena Parthenos toward the ship, and Annabeth is injured. Oh, I just realized we never mentioned that they saved Nico.
Oh, yeah, they saved Nico.
And he told them that the doors of death are inside Tartarus because he went there. That's probably important.
Here's my thing. Rereading this book, I'm like, it is so obvious they have to go to Tartarus in this book. But I remember, like, when I first read it, it's just one of those game-changing things where you just don't even think it's on the table. Yeah. Like, it was so built up and so scary in The Lightning Thief, and that just kind of, like, continues on. So I was sitting there and I was like, but there's so much, like at one point Gaia literally says, like, enjoy your journey in Tartarus.
Yeah, and you're like, metaphorically?
So I'm like, how did I not pick up on all this foreshadowing? And what I'm realizing also is Rick did pull some sneaky shit here. Because everything is wrapped up and resolved. And he lets it sit like that for a few pages. He lets everything be resolved. He lets them have achieved all of their goals. He lets everything happen. They're all going to get away. They've all reunited. It's going to be fine. And then Arachne balrogs Annabeth.
Right. So it turns out Annabeth has part of the web still wrapped around her ankle, and she didn't realize. And so she's still tied to Arachne, who is currently falling. Mm-hmm. She starts being dragged toward the pit. Percy manages to grab her. And I love this moment where Hazel is the only one who realizes what's going on for a second. And she's yelling for help, but like no one's really responding fast enough or even hears her.
Because the statue's also falling, so they're all trying to get that out of there.
Yeah, I mean, basically what happens here is Percy catches Annabeth, and then he realizes that there's no way for him to pull her up, and so decides that the best thing to do is to fall with her and to try to close the doors of death from the inside, since Nico at this point has told them that the doors of death will likely have to be closed from both sides. And so he yells up, this is what the plot of the next book is going to be. We're going to find the doors down here, and you're going to find the doors up there. He makes Nico promise, which I've already talked about how big of a thing promise is in this series, where it's like if you break one, it's over for you, but it's especially over for you in this series because it's part of the prophecy, is that someone's going to have an oath to keep with a final breath. So I remember when this book came out, every time anyone made a promise, because there's some big promises in this book, it was like, don't do that. But especially that one, this is the one that scared me the most at the time, was Percy making Nico promise to lead everyone to the doors of death and that they would see them there. So yeah, Percy, let's go. And they fall.
Bananas
Twist
moment.
of the century. Cliffhanger of the millennia. So do you have a bead for this book? I mean, it's got to be one of those Chinese finger traps, right?
I think my bead for this book, I think it's that image of the dog with the skin pulled back with the bones. Where it's like, I'm already dead. Because that, honestly, that describes Jason. It kind of foreshadows the fall.
Yeah, I like that. It is complicated for me to have to draw later on.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Monster Donut. If you want to see the cool art Phoebe has drawn for this episode, you can check out our Instagram, Twitter, at PJOPod, or if you're feeling fancy, you can check out our TikTok as well, which is also at PJOPod. And if you feel so inclined, you can send us a tip on Ko-fi or coffee. Links are in our link tree on all of our sites. And if you have any thoughts, analyses, or questions, you can email us at monsterdonutpodcast@gmail.com. We are eventually planning to do a wrap-up episode like we did with the first series, so if any questions pop into your mind that you want to send in, please do so. And also, if you want to support us in any way non-monetarily, it's always great to leave a rating on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. And send us a message if you want our House of Hades episode to be much longer than normal.
And we just won't edit it. It'll be 6 hours long.
Oh my god.